I was looking at a map of the United States the other day, and I was just kind of tracing my finger right to the dead center. And obviously, you land on Kansas.
Right in the middle.
Yeah, and I have to admit, when I think of Kansas, my brain immediately goes to this very specific, very quiet place. I think of the Wizard of Oz. I think of these endless flat highways and wheat, just oceans of wheat.
That's the standard association. You're not alone there. For most people, Kansas is like the perfect example of a flyover state.
Yeah.
It's the peaceful agrarian backdrop while the coasts and the cities do all the loud, dramatic stuff.
Right. But then I started reading through this whole stack of research you sent over for today's deep dive, and I realized I owe the entire state an apology.
Yeah, yeah.
Because quiet is about the last word I would use to describe what I just read.
It's a total misconception. That whole quiet heartland image is, it's a relatively modern invention. If you actually dig into the sources, and we've got a fascinating mix today, everything from colonial maps to Civil War diaries and even cattle drive logs, you realize that for a huge chunk of American history, Kansas wasn't the background at all.
It was the main character.
It was the main character. And usually, it was the setting for the most volatile, violent, and politically charged events in the entire country.
It's a study in extremes. I mean, we're talking about the literal spark that ignited the Civil War. We're talking about the bloodiest, wildest days of the Wild West. Conquistadors looking for gold, guerrilla warfare, religious zealots. It feels like every intense chapter of American history had a scene filmed in Kansas.
It's a crucible. That's the word that kept coming to me. To really understand the United States, the messy, ambitious, violent parts of our history, you have to understand Kansas.
So that's our mission today. We are going to peel back that layer of corn and soybeans to figure out how this territory, which had the terrifying nickname Bleeding Kansas, somehow transformed into the Free State, and then, eventually into agricultural powerhouse we know today.
And to do that, we actually have to start way before the politics. We have to start with the land itself.
Okay, let's get everyone oriented. We're squarely in the Midwest, landlocked. You've got Nebraska to the north, Missouri east, Oklahoma south, Colorado to the west. But the name Kansas, I always just assumed it was a name, but the etymology is actually really beautiful.
It is, isn't it? The state is named after the Kansas River, but the river itself was named by the French after the people living on its banks, the Kansas people, or the Kaw. And the translation that you see in our sources is people of the South Wind.
People of the South Wind? Wow, that sounds like something out of a fantasy novel.
It's so evocative. Now, linguists might argue over whether that's the strict literal translation, but it's the one that really stuck in the cultural imagination. And it fits. I mean, it's open country. The wind is a defining feature of life there.
And the sources really emphasize that the native history there wasn't, one monolithic group. There was this real divide based on the geography.
Exactly. The geography dictated the lifestyle. So in the eastern part of the state, in the river valleys, you had tribes that were more sedentary. They lived in villages, they farmed. But as you move west, the land flattens out, the trees disappear.
Right.
And that's where you found these semi-nomadic tribes, the hunters, following those huge herds of bison.
It's amazing how the environment shaped culture so distinctly even back then, but here's where I lost a bet with myself. I assumed the first Europeans to stomp around Kansas were like French fur trappers coming down from Canada.
A good guess, but you would be wrong.
Way wrong. It was the Spanish Francisco Vázquez de Coronado in 1541. That's Shakespeare's era. That is incredibly early for the middle of North America.
It really puts the timeline in perspective, doesn't it? Coronado was a conquistador. He was pushing north from Mexico. He wasn't looking for good farmland. He was chasing a myth, the 7 cities of gold.
He thought there was a literal city of gold in Kansas.
He did. He was looking for a place called Quivira. And when he got there, he found the Wichita people living in these grass lodges. A very resourceful culture, but definitely not made of gold.
I can't imagine the disappointment. You march thousands of miles in heavy armor expecting El Dorado, and you find tall grass.
He basically wrote back to the King of Spain saying the land is fertile, the soil is black, but there's no wealth here. So the Spanish largely lost interest. But, and this is a key takeaway from the notes, technically, this was Spanish territory for a long time. Between 1763 and 1803, Kansas was part of Spanish Louisiana.
There was even a governor mentioned, Louis Gonzaga, the conciliator.
Right. He wasn't your typical colonial governor. He was actually promoting expeditions, trying to foster trade relationships with the native tribes. It was this weird, fluid zone of Spanish control and French influence.
Until the landlord changed. 1803, the Louisiana Purchase.
The U.S. buys this massive chunk of the continent. But here's a detail that often gets skipped in history class.
Mm.
Even after 1803, the whole state wasn't American. The southwest corner of what is now Kansas was still technically Spain,
And then Mexico.
then Mexico. Then it was the Republic of Texas for a bit. That corner didn't officially become U.S. territory until 1848, after the Mexican-American War. So the borders we see on the map today were drawn in blood and ink over centuries.
Speaking of blood, let's fast forward to 1854. This seems to be the moment Kansas stops being a remote territory and becomes the center of the universe.
The year, everything changed. The Kansas-Nebraska Act.
May 30th, 1854. This new law opens the territory to white settlement. But it wasn't just a land grab, was it? It was like a political trap.
It was a massive failure of leadership, really. The federal government didn't want to decide the slavery issue is too hot to touch. So they came up with this idea of popular sovereignty.
Meaning?
They said, we won't decide if Kansas is a free state or a slave state. We'll let the settlers who live there vote on it.
Which, on paper, sounds democratic, let the people decide. But in the context of 1854, with the country just tearing itself apart over slavery.
It was a disaster waiting to happen
Yeah.
because it turned migration into a military strategy. If the majority wins, then you just need to send more people than the other side immediately.
So it triggered a race. On one side, you have abolitionists, the free staters, pouring in from Massachusetts, New England. They weren't just looking for a farm, they were on a moral crusade.
Exactly. The New England Emigrant Aid Company was literally sending people there specifically to vote no on slavery.
And on the other side, you have settlers pouring across the border from Missouri and Arkansas slave states right next door. And they're coming in to make sure Kansas becomes a slave state to protect their own interests. And they weren't just bringing ballots.
No, they were bringing rifles.
And this is where we get the term bleeding Kansas. And looking at the accounts in our sources, that name, it wasn't a metaphor.
No, it was literal. It was guerrilla warfare, a proxy war for the Civil War, fought years before the official war even began. Night raids, assassinations, burning towns, neighbors killing neighbors.
The figure that just looms largest here is, of course, John Brown.
A polarizing figure doesn't even begin to cover it. He was an ardent abolitionist who believed that slavery was such a profound sin that it could only be washed away with blood.
And the source details the Potawatomi Massacre in 1856. This is one of the darkest moments. Brown and his sons dragged pro-slavery settlers out of their cabins at night.
And hacked them to death with broadswords.
Broadswords. In 1856. That is just, it's so visceral. It sounds medieval.
It was meant to be terrifying, and it was. It terrified the South. It radicalized everyone. On the other side, you had pro-slavery militias sacking the town of Lawrence, which was the headquarters of the Free State movement.
So you have years of this tit-for-tat slaughter. But eventually, a decision had to be made. Who won the demographic war?
The abolitionists. They just plain outnumbered the pro-slavery settlers in the end. So on January 29th, 1861, Kansas entered the Union as the 34th state, and it entered as a free state.
Hence the nickname, the Free State. It wasn't a default setting. They fought a war for it.
They earned it. But, and this is the tragic irony, getting into the Union didn't stop the violence. Think about the date, January 1861. What happens just 3 months later?
Fort Sumter. The Civil War starts.
Exactly. So Kansas goes from a brutal guerrilla war directly into the national war. And because of all the bad blood that had built up, the fighting there was particularly nasty.
The source details one event that really drives this home. The raid on Lawrence in 1863.
August 21st, 1863.
Led by a man named William Quantrill. This story is absolute nightmare fuel. Quantrill leads hundreds of Confederate sympathizers into Lawrence at dawn, and they aren't there to capture the town.
No, they're there to erase it. They killed nearly 200 men and boys. They burned the entire town to the ground. It was a massacre.
Just pure vengeance.
Pure vengeance. But here's a nuance from the source that I found fascinating. It tells you everything you need to know about Quantrill. His actions were so brutal, so uncontrolled, that even the Confederate military leadership eventually rejected him.
Wait, really?
Yeah, he applied for an official commission, a rank, and they looked at his record and said, no, you are too much for us.
Wow. When the Confederacy, which is desperate for fighters, says you're too violent, you know you've crossed a line.
It just reinforces that idea of Kansas as a crucible. The heat was just higher there. It was personal.
So, okay, the war ends, 1865. You'd think, all right, Kansas, you've had enough. Time to settle down, grow some wheat, maybe take a nap.
You would think. But the post-war era brings a whole new wave of people, and with them, a totally different kind of intensity. First, we have to talk about the exodusters.
I loved this part of the reading. It's such a powerful pivot. Who are the exodusters?
These were African Americans fleeing the South in the late 1870s. Reconstruction is collapsing. Jim Crow laws are on the rise. Violence is rampant. They need to get out.
And they look at a map and choose Kansas. Why there?
Because of the history we just talked about. To them, Kansas wasn't just land, it was the land of John Brown. It was the free state. They saw it almost biblically as a promised land where they could finally be safe.
The source mentions Benjamin Pap Singleton as a key organizer. It's amazing to think of the courage it took to pack up everything and head to the plains based on an idea of freedom.
It really is. And it solidified that moral identity of the state.
You're right. At the exact same time, in the exact same state, you have a completely different energy taking over the western half.
Oh, yes. The cowboy hats are coming on. We are entering the Wild West. The Chisholm Trail opens up. And all of a sudden, Kansas is the destination for millions of longhorn cattle coming up from Texas to get to the railroad.
And this is the era of the legends. The source drops some heavy hitters. Wild Bill Hickok, Bat Masterson, Wyatt Earp.
And these guys were serving as marshals and sheriffs in towns like Hayes, Abilene, and especially Dodge City. And they had to be tough because these were not sleepy villages.
No, they were boom towns. We have to talk about Dodge City, the queen of the cow towns. The scale of this operation blew my mind. The source says that in a single year, 8 million head of cattle came through.
8 million. Just trying to picture that.
I'm trying to imagine the smell.
The smell, the dust, the noise. And you have thousands of cowboys who've been on the trail for months. They just got paid. They want whiskey, they want cards, and they all have guns.
It's a recipe for disaster.
It was pure chaos. That's why you needed figures like Earp and Masterson. It wasn't about being a hero. It was about trying to keep a lid on a pressure cooker. The violence here wasn't political anymore, like in Bleeding Kansas. It was commercial. It was rowdy.
So we've gone from Bleeding Kansas to Wild West Kansas. It seems like the state just could not catch a break from the adrenaline, one extreme to the other.
Well, that kind of chaos tends to provoke a reaction. You know, for every action, there's a reaction. And in Kansas, the pendulum swung hard.
This is where the story takes a turn I absolutely did not see coming. We go from saloons and shootouts to total prohibition.
It's a stark pivot, but if you look closely, it's actually connected to that old abolitionist history. It's that same moral religious fervor.
So the same type of people who hated slavery also hated alcohol.
Often, yes. The Methodists and the evangelical Protestants gained huge influence. They saw the lawlessness of the cow towns and just said, enough. In 1881, Kansas became the first state in the U.S. to write prohibition into its constitution.
The first.
Yeah.
Before the 18th Amendment, before the national ban.
Decades before. And get this, while the rest of the country gave up on prohibition in 1933, Kansas kept the ban in their state constitution all the way until 1948.
1948. So for almost 70 years, the home of Dodge City and the saloon brawl was completely dry. That is some serious whiplash.
It just shows that strong streak of moral reformism in the state's DNA. They don't do things halfway. When they decide something is right, they go all in. Which brings us to another pioneer mentioned in the stack.
Ella Afemari.
Yes,
No.
1922. Women have only recently gotten the right to vote nationally. And here comes Ella Afemari running for governor of Kansas.
And there was that quirky detail. She ran under the name Mrs. W.D. Mary.
Which sounds so strange to us now, but it was common for the time. Using her husband's initials was maybe a way to gain a bit of legitimacy, but her message was purely forward-looking.
Yeah, she had this quote I circled. Someone has to be a pioneer. I firmly believe that one day a woman will sit in the governor's chair in Kansas.
And she was right, of course. It took a while, but she set the precedent. And it fits that theme we've been seeing, Kansas as a place where people try things first. Whether it's a political experiment like popular sovereignty, or a social one like prohibition, or a barrier-breaking run for office.
So, bringing it up to the present day, the broadswords are put away, the saloons are legal again. What did the sources say about modern Kansas?
Well, it's finally settled into that role of the agricultural powerhouse. The stats from 2015 and 2020 just paint a picture of incredibly high-yield production. Wheat, corn, sorghum, soybeans. It's feeding the world.
With a population of, roughly 2.9 million people?
Right. It's the 15th largest state by area, but it feels massive because of that open landscape. And I have to mention the geography one last time. We started with the land. We should end with it.
The highest point?
The highest point. It's called Mount Sunflower.
Mount Sunflower. That is the most Kansas name I could possibly imagine. I love it.
It's at 4,039 feet, which surprises people. Everyone thinks Kansas is flat as a pancake, but it actually rises significantly as you move west toward the Rockies. It's a subtle rise, but it's there.
So, pulling this all together, we started with this idea of a quiet flyover state, but we've uncovered a history that is loud, violent, and just. Deeply influential.
I mean, if you connect it to the bigger picture, Kansas is really a microcosm of the American struggle. We see the displacement of Native peoples, the colonial power struggles, the violent birth of the Civil War. We see the hope of the exodusters and the lawlessness of frontier capitalism.
It's like every major chapter of American history had a really intense scene filmed in Kansas.
That's a great way to put it. It's a state that has constantly reinvented itself, but always with really high stakes.
And it seems like the people there have always been intense,
Mm.
passionate, whether they were fighting for a free state, driving cattle, or smashing whiskey barrels.
Which brings me to a final thought for you to think about. I'm going to go back to that Ella Ufe Maury quote. Someone has to be a pioneer. When you look at the whole history of Kansas, from those first settlers to the exodusters to the suffragists, it seems to be defined by people willing to go first into difficult territory. It makes you wonder, what is it about that landscape, that south wind, that attracts people who are willing to struggle for a new idea? It's not just about farming, it's about breaking new ground, literally and metaphorically.
That is definitely something to chew on. Next time you're on a flight looking down at that patchwork of green and gold squares, just remember there's a lot of blood, sweat, and very loud history in that soil.
Absolutely.
That's it for this deep dive into the Free State. Remember, there's always more beneath the surface. Thanks for listening.